We hope the title kind of captured some of it, and that is that we're trying to steer a course where we could, I suppose at any point in time, this one no more central than others, we could wring our hands, as many scholarly and academic, scientific scholarly fields worry and wonder, and I'm sure all of you, like all of us, wake up each day and kind of continue that wondering. Or we could think about how we can advance and benefit from education research in confrontational and tumultuous times. So I'm just going to briefly read our charge to this group that we threw a kind of a open-ended set of questions with the introduction being, we're living in a time when we see that some publics are increasingly valuing science to support open discourse and sound decision-making, as evident from not only a U.S. but really international movement and march for science that is people-driven and youth-driven, and a press to promote and make accessible knowledge for all. Indeed, the right to education and the right to science and knowledge were the subject of an earlier panel mid-morning today. Yet it's also a period, as we know, when fields of science and scholarship are more observably being limited, denied, or under attack, and where scholars who in particular raise challenging questions may experience efforts to delegitimize their work. So our opening questions to the panel, and my co-chair will elaborate and introduce our panelists, is what does this mean for fields of science and scholarship like education research? What are the implications for education research as a field to navigate a world where our mission and purpose may be contested rather than embraced? I think we like to think in education research we have a particular social responsibility. Our field in particular is dedicated to advancing knowledge that allows for building critical inquiry skills, for ensuring safe spaces to explore ideas and engage in innovative problem solving, and for enhancing the human capacity to support, help, and enable the development and dignity of others. So while all fields are really struggling with this, we see it in the atmospheric and environmental sciences, and we see it across arenas of scholarship. But our field not only aspires to advance and navigate the kind of work we do, but we also have this special social responsibility to try to educate about these very issues that can make a difference in these tumultuous times. So with that opening two questions, let me turn it over to Vivian.
Thank you so much, Felice. And hello and welcome to all of you. We are really thrilled that you're here to be a part of this conversation. And I want to especially thank the panelists. Much of what Felice discussed briefly came about as well with the former presidents in our ongoing discussions. I guess I should stand up. Our ongoing discussions about the ways in which we can contribute to a meaningful and rigorous discourse as well as action around major issues affecting our field and ensuring the strength of science in our work. I think it's been a part of previous past presidents' discussions. I only recently became a past president, and so I'm very happy to be a part of the conversation. It's a lovely, close-knit group, and the opportunities to kind of build a conversation around this in AERA, to expand upon it, and to kind of be able to offer meaningful and significant insights would be our goal in thinking through this issue today. So in order, I'm not going to do much in the way of biographical work, except to tell you the names and affiliations of my colleagues. To my immediate left is our colleague James Banks from the University of Washington, Next to Jim is Joyce King from Georgia State University. Next to Joyce, there's William Tate from Washington University. Next to him is William Tierney from the University of Southern California. And our last panelist is someone that we all know because we just heard her yesterday give her outstanding talk, and that would be Deborah Ball from the University of Michigan. So the panelists will all talk about 5 to 7 or 8 minutes, and then we will. 7? Okay, I never. Okay, this kept changing. Okay, so 5 to 7 minutes, and offering a commentary, a perspective on this topic, because obviously we don't have answers, but we think about these issues on a regular basis, and so they will provide a short commentary. After that, we will open up for questions, and I think everyone will have. Those who want to speak will be asked to line up here and will be given a microphone to pose questions that our audience will offer a perspective on. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Jen.
Yeah, is this mic on?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I sometimes don't need one, but the divisive, confrontational, and tumultuous time in which we are living seriously imperil democracy and indicate how fragile democracies are. The fragility of democracy is becoming increasingly evident by the rise of xenophobia, institutional racism, and the quest for social cohesion and hyper-nationalism that are taking place in nations around the world. The election of conservative politicians in a number of nations is also a manifestation of the resurgence of neoliberalism, the rise of popular nationalism, and the pushback on social justice, globalization, and the quest for equality. In her new book, which I strongly recommend, called Fascism, A Warning, Madeleine Albright, the United States Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001, described the ways in which democracy is threatened in nations around the world, including within the Western nations. And I'm going to quote her by what she says: the rise of authoritarian leaders who've been propelled to power by incidents such as global migration, terrorism, sectarian conflicts, vulnerable borders, rogue social media, and the cynical schemes of ambitious men. The new anger that feeds fascism is evident across the Atlantic in the growth of nativistic movements opposed to the idea of a united Europe, end of quote. Albright also describes how democracy is fragile and threatened in the United States, Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Germany, Russia, China, and the Philippines. Because the democracy is so fragile in nations around the world, and the ways in which it is threatened, educational researchers and scholars should produce transformative research and scholarship that challenge authoritarian and non-democratic policies and practices. In these toxic and troubled times, educational research and scholarship should support policies, practice, and institutions that produce, perpetuate, and enhance democracy and a democratic way of life. Because democracy is threatened, not only around the world, but in the United States itself, as Albright points out. The history of educational research is replete with examples that reinforce inequality and institutional racism. An important example is the bell curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. It was published in 1994 and was widely cited and discussed and legitimized, by the way. However, there is also a robust body of social science research that support educational equality for marginalized communities that date back from the turn of the century, that was undertaken by African American scholars such as Carter Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Alain Locke, and there's a wonderful biography of Alain Locke I'd like to recommend called The New Negro. This research was created by researchers, this research that's transformative and committed to the liberation of oppressed groups. This research was created by researchers with life experiences and values that differed in significant ways from those of researchers such as Herrnstein and Murphy, who were outsiders to the African American community they wrote about. This research of the liberatory research includes the anti-racist paradigm constructed during the 30s and 40s by Franz Boas at Columbia University in this city, and the group of anthropologists that he trained at Columbia, such as Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. This research, also by the research that was summarized in a brief by a group of social scientists to support the plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. And that, of course, that included the research by Mamie and Kenneth Clark. And of course, we have a robust body of research by researchers who are committed to liberation and progressive policies such as Gerner Lerner and gender work, John Hope Franklin, Rodolfo Acuna, Ronald Takaki, and Darlene Clark Hines are all examples of liberatory research which we need to emphasize in this era when democracy is so fragile. Although researchers and scholars should undertake transformative research that challenge inequality and anti-democratic policies and practices, objectivity should be an aim of our research and scholarship. We can't give up on the aim of objectivity, but as I'm going to argue in my little 5 minutes, if I haven't exceeded them, that what I'm going to argue in my 5 minutes is that objectivity must remain an aim of our research, even though we got to rethink what objectivity means. Oh, I'm going to have 2 more. Thank you. Even though research is embedded within social science and educational research, objectivity should be a goal. And I'm going to try to go fast. But we have to rethink what objectivity is. And we have to aim for what Sandra Harding calls strong objectivity. And that means strong objectivity is derived when scholars from diverse groups participate in formulating the canon and criteria for determining objectivity. So that George Homans, in his wonderful book called The Nature of Social Science, he said what makes a science are its aim and not its results. So we need to make the value premises of research explicit and help social scientists become more objective. Murdahl also argues that no social science can ever be neutral or simply factual, indeed not objective in the traditional meaning in the word. Murdahl says that research is always, and by logical necessity, based on morals and political evaluation, and the researcher should be obligated to account for their values explicitly. I'm going to go on and summarize. Basically what I'm trying to say is that researchers should be committed to defending democracy when it is fragile. James McGregor Burns, I'm going to lead to my conclusion within 2 minutes. James McGregor Burns says that he defined that we researchers should be intellectual. Burns defined intellectuals as researchers who pursue normative ends. He writes, the person who deals with analytical ideas and data alone as a theorist, the one who works with normative ideas is a moralist, the person who deals with both and unites them through disciplined imagination is an intellectual. Intellectuals should be knowledgeable about the values that are exemplified in their research and committed to supporting educational policies that foster democracy and educational equality. Kenneth Clark, one of my heroes, argues that the intellectual must seek the truth, but this truth must be within a value framework. Kenneth Clark, and I'm going to just end with a quote from Kenneth Clark and then one from James Baldwin. The preface to Kenneth Clark's book, Dark Ghetto, is an absolute classic. The epilogue in the beginning of that book. If you haven't read it, go back and read it. Clark said the important part of my creed as a social scientist is that on the grounds of absolute objectivity or a posture of scientific detachment and indifference, a truly relevant and serious social science cannot be taken seriously by a society desperately in need of moral and empirical guidance in human affairs. Social scientists cannot be, as Zen said, neutral on a moving train, because the fate of researchers are highly connected to the fate of all the nation's citizens. And I'm going to end with a quote from James Baldwin that encapsulates this idea. James Baldwin, in an open letter to Angela Davis, wrote, "If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, or render impassable with our bodies the corridors to the gas chambers. For if they come for you in the morning, they will come for us that night." Thank you.
I'm going to begin with an apology. I'm coping with a cough, and so I hope I can get through this without coughing, but it's not contagious. I want to trouble what I think is a very elegant theme, but I do want to trouble the notion that we are in confrontational and tumultuous times. This is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, the 50th anniversary of Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and it's the 50th anniversary of my experience as a student at Stanford University in '68 when we took over the university administration, locked up the trustees and made demands, which included establishing an African American Studies program. And our 10th demand, which was never fulfilled, was for the establishment of a research center. Instead, they gave us a party house. So I'm going to be somewhat reflective on my experience becoming a researcher. I have if I can get my thing rolled up here. Carter G. Woodson urged us to think black. And by that, he meant that we should be thinking in the interests of African American people. He was known as the founder of Black History or Negro History Month. So when I teach and do research, I often qualify that notion of my commitment to the African American community by saying, this is not a commitment only to African American people, it's a commitment to humanity. But because of the context in which we live, as soon as we say black, people tend to think of that as an isolated, separate commitment, and it is not. So this is also the anniversary of black students at San Francisco State establishing the first African American or ethnic studies program in higher education. So I'm giving these examples to remind us that the times we are in today are a continuation of the times we've been in. It seems like a new period, it is, but it's only an extension of what has been going on all along. As an undergraduate, I had a running debate with my professor, St. Clair Drake, who was the first director of African American Studies at Stanford. Drake told us, you do your activism after 5 and your scholarship during the day. Well, that was a generational difference, and I had that debate with him for many years, all the way through graduate school. But I knew that we wouldn't see things the same way. So I've become an engaged researcher on behalf of the community with a consciousness that many of the vaunted proclamations that we embrace as Americans are actually somewhat mythological. This is also the middle of the decade of the UN International Decade for People of African Ancestry. How many people know that we're in the middle of that decade declared by the United Nations? So I'm happy to tell you that we are in the middle of the decade of the UN commitment to people of African ancestry. And what we are struggling with is a global problem of oppression, a global problem of miseducation that has not allowed either researchers or educators to be fully apprised of the nature of the struggle that we are facing. So as a researcher, what I've tried to do is to respond to this conversation that I had with Drake, and using some of the scholarship in the African intellectual tradition, the Black intellectual tradition. I would refer you to Jacob Carruthers' book written in 1999 titled Intellectual Warfare. Carruthers wrote, "The science of oppression works for the master and produces a master's mentality. We have to understand where it came from, what it does and has done to us, and what it does to humanity in general. We must replace it with a methodology and metaphysics that restores the world and gives light to everybody." So as a graduate student, how did this science over oppression, how did I experience it? I wrote my comprehensive exam on Arthur Jensen's 1969 article in Harvard Ed Review arguing about the heritability, the inherent inferiority of African American people. So we have a continuation from that kind of scholarship through the bell curve to where we are today, and it has, this perspective has informed the mindset of the very people who have helped to contribute to the times that we're in. Sociologist George Lipset has aptly observed, it's hard because we've been made into the kinds of people who fit into this society, and we academics have a lot to unlearn. This experience is common among scholars of African ancestry, whether here or in other countries. Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, another scholar whose work I would recommend to you, he wrote the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. When he was a student, he wrote, "It was necessary to come to grips with the way in which one's being and the presentation of one's being was so hopelessly distorted in the sources to which one went for scholarship." I want to emphasize that as learners, as we're trying to prepare ourselves to make our contributions, the very sources that we have to go to tell us that there's something wrong with us. So I'm just underscoring and trying to trouble the theme as if the times are suddenly tumultuous or the times are suddenly confrontational. They are not. So I want to end with a quote, another quote from, to illustrate this ethos. In the 60s, when I was a student struggling to become a scholar and participate in the production of knowledge, I was also very much informed by the philosophy of Julius Nyerere, who was president of Tanzania. Back then, we had a kind of global consciousness, and we looked outside of the U.S. for examples of struggle and identity. That's when African countries were throwing off colonialism, and we were very much shaped by those commitments of people in other parts of the world. Nyerere expressed this philosophy. Those who receive this privilege of education, therefore, have a duty to repay the sacrifice which others have made. They are like the man who has been given all the food available in a starving village in order that he might have strength to bring supplies back from a distant place. If he takes this food and does not bring help to his brothers, he is a traitor. Similarly, if the young men and women who are given an education by the people of this republic adopt attitudes of superiority or fail to use their knowledge to help the development of this country, then they are betraying our union. That philosophy is what inspired many of those in my generation to join with community people, to challenge the notion of objectivity in research, and to say that the walls between the university and the community really need to come down so that we can fulfill our obligation to those who made sacrifices to send us to the university. I still see students in my classes at Georgia State University who tell me, well, I was told that maybe I shouldn't try to research that question because maybe I should wait until I get out and get a job, and maybe that would be too much bias in my work, so that the generations of students that we have right now are still being obstructed from learning in a way that marries their skills and knowledge to the needs of the community. And I'll stop there.
All right. I guess. Thank you. So I was pondering what to say after hearing my first two colleagues. I always pivot in real time. I pondered, and the thing I thought about was a movie when I think about education research or even science research in the context of politics. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. And I really want to try to explain what I mean in a moment. I live in a world in St. Louis that's dominated by regimes. By regime, I mean it's a public-private partnership established to attain a particular aim. St. Louis Metro is known as one of the best created segregation regimes ever created. It's one of the most powerful public-private partnerships put together. Today, after the Ferguson scenario, we are attempting to dismantle that regime using a slogan called Better Together. And part of the strategy is to argue that if we combine the county and the city, it would do things like lower the metrics associated with crime. So, for example, the denominator would become bigger, and thus your crime rate data would be better. And if you do that, then people are more likely to want to come there. And it's rhetorical strategies of this sort that you see. We also are, in St. Louis, a big sports town. So we have a sports regime that is quite powerful. Most recently, we lost our football team to my colleague city, the Los Angeles area. And now, I want to put that into some context. At the time, we raised between public-private groups over $450 million to keep a losing football franchise that caused brain injury. It's phenomenal what you can do in a regime. You can put together persuasive rhetorical strategies, things like it's going to make the downtown better, even though the empirical evidence suggests that that is not the case. However, it just seems to work. It's quite powerful, right? Like you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. Okay, so we are a biotechnology hub. We want to be the biotechnology leader in the world in St. Louis. And it's quite powerful the way the rhetorical strategy is put together. We're told that this science will undergird the evolution of our city. However, we have some of the lowest science scores in the state of Missouri, and those people indigenous to the state will have into the metro area will probably have very little opportunity to take advantage of the biotechnology regime that's being put together. It's all going to be in-migration of individuals who come to Washington University and St. Louis University. They're not going to be native. And those there will actually subsidize through taxes this biotechnology effort, and they won't be able to participate at all. But they're sold this wonderful idea that they're going to be part of this discovery process. We also have, we just had the Amazon regime. This was one of the greatest bait and switch strategies that I've ever seen in my life. So you're actually going to give tax credits and subsidies to a company to come to your region whose main purpose is distribution, and that would put people out of work who are actually going to subsidize their arrival because they are largely in retail and service industries. It's amazing what you can sell when you package these things. So what I want to say to you today is that we really need to learn how people use persuasion. The persuasion regime is at its core what's missing in education research and the scientific endeavors more broadly. Now, there are things we can learn from other academic literatures. We know from political science, and in fact, there's a great piece that emerged today in MIT Technology Review, 2008 by Temple. Look it up. He lays out what I'm going to describe for you today. I'm going to call it C cubed, or maybe 3C. I think it's exponential, so I'm going to say C cubed. And there are 3 C's that you need to attend to if you want to be in the persuasion regime game. Number 1, you have to choose the right target. Political scientists consistently demonstrate that mass opinion does not drive policy debate. I'm going to repeat that again. Mass opinion does not drive policy debate. In fact, it's just the opposite. Partisan divisions occur among elites. And elite advocacy groups, high-profile commentators, and politicians who are go-to are the people who actually make and create these the divides that we have. And they, in turn, set the terms of the debate in the public mind, spending and spreading their money on sound bites in media appearances, editorials, social media, and so on. And the reason I think it's exponential because social media has just escalated their ability to do that. The people, in turn, based upon their experience, demography, the social networks, and ideologies, pick a political party that resonates with these elite divisions. They defer in tribal fashion to these leaders to sort out the details of policy and evidence, science included. And it's here that the real focus should be taking place. Point of fact, and this makes it simple, you only really have to target a small number of people to influence. The bad part is they're very stubborn, right? So you don't have to convince the world, you just have to convince a few. Number 2, you have to craft your facts in a depolitical way, if you will. You have to appeal to the interests and language and lexicon and ideology of the group in which you're trying to influence. That's what happens in these regimes that happen in my community. We figure out a way to get that avid sports fan who's going to get taken to the cleaners to pay the taxes to keep this losing football franchise. I mean, it's amazing. We do it really well in industries we care about, right? We've never been able to do it for education. These same people, all of them got together for the segregation regime to keep it in place. All of them got together for the biotechnology regime to establish it. All of them got together for the sports regimes to establish it. But no language to deal with the St. Louis public schools, right? The third thing is you have to find a common ground. It's sort of, I would call it a co-benefit theory. You have to find a way to bring basic facts on a matter to a group in such a way that they see not only are they going to benefit, but you're going to benefit. It's called win-win. And what I see most of the time in rhetorical strategies in education is just a soft appeal on some moralistic framing that generally doesn't deal with cost-benefit for the individuals who are going to be actually investing in it more broadly. And I think that's just a losing strategy. And so I'm going to stop right there and just say I think there's a lot to be learned from persuasion regimes, and I hope it's something that we begin to take seriously in education. Thank you.
For 2 minutes, I'd like to go down memory lane. And I am old enough and gay enough to have lived through the AIDS crisis. And I agree with Joyce that this is a continuation. But I also think it's a disruption. So, you know, as a newly minted PhD at Stanford, I ended up in Boulder, Colorado, in a postdoc for 2 years. And the little that I knew about policy implementation, I helped start the Boulder County AIDS Project because it was desperately needed. And I would wear my little tie and coat, and I would talk to people quite rationally. I also was involved in ACT UP, and we would block buildings, we'd lay down in the streets, we'd do all sorts of very irrational things. And both of those groups couldn't stand one another. The policy folks thought the ACT UP people were very inappropriate. And the ACT UP folks thought that nothing was going to ever happen if we didn't riot now. And again, for those who didn't live through it, people were dying. People you knew. So you had to do something. 2 years later, I end up at Penn State. And really, it's the same story. Okay, so I work trying to create a gay inclusive curriculum with the state. And I had to put on my little suit, and I testify before the legislature. And I can remember a legislator saying, "Professor Tierney, this is on Penn State letterhead. What gives you the right to say this?" Right? And I said, "I'm an assistant professor of education. This is an area of inquiry that I know." And the guy says, "Did the president okay this?" Talk about a scary question to a young guy. We didn't have a law school at Penn State, and they kept telling us that you couldn't have a non-discrimination clause. It was just illegal to do that. You couldn't do it. But finally we figured out, you know what? Actually, you can do it. So we met with the Board of Trustees, who were some of the good folks, and we convinced them and persuaded them in a very rational way. But at the same time, I organized a protest around Old Main that people hated. It was the graduate students and about 4 young faculty, because the tenured full professors had too much to lose. We organized a protest around the rec center when the Lady Lions went to the NCAAs because the women's basketball coach was a bigot. We support the Lady Lions. We do not support discrimination. And again, it was the same thing, that there were people who were saying, this is so inappropriate. We even had faculty doing this. And you've got other people saying, nice doesn't do it. And that's the way I feel today. I feel that Trump reminds me of a crisis. I've lived through Reagan. I've lived through Bush 1 and Bush 2. Horrible. But the question is, what do we do? And I actually think, since Trump has come in, that the Fourth Estate, some in the Fourth Estate, have really stepped up. And they have done some pretty darn good reporting. Not everybody, but some. But in general, I think our universities and our associations have not. And I think a lot of us don't know what to do. And you know what? I will be happy with if you're in this camp or this camp. But we gotta do something. You gotta do something. I gotta do something. Because somewhere in the future, people are gonna ask each of us, where were you? And that's the question that haunts me with regard to the AIDS crisis. There were a lot of my friends who died. It wasn't sort of an esoteric issue. And for folks to say, I'm going to sit this one out, is not a sufficient answer. Thanks.
So I think one thing that we've heard across all of my previous colleagues is something about what does it mean to be neutral or not. And I think Bill's comment just now echoes something that I said yesterday, which is, quoting Imani Goffney, nothing is neutral. Acting or inacting is not, whatever you do, it's not neutral. So I wanted, since I'm the last person, to pick up some threads that have already come up. One about Jim's point about objectivity and his point about democracy being under siege and being threatened, citing Madeleine Albright. I think Joyce, I mean, there are many things you all said, but another would be the times are a continuation, but also we've been made to be people who fit in. I want to pick that up. I want to pick up the persuasion regimes and pick up the disruption. So I wanted to talk about 2 categories of things. One having to do with, I guess I'll pick it up and just use the persuasion notion, because I think that's a really interesting way to put it. I was going to say teaching, just being me, I was going to call it teaching, but teaching's also persuasion. But I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about our responsibilities for educating the next generation of people who will be sitting on this panel 30 or 40 years from now. Because I think we're not talking about that. We're actually inactive, and we're going to be in big trouble. So the first about communicating or teaching, let's say teaching, persuasion, to cite Professor Tate. I think thinking about that as the very interesting points about whom do we have to persuade, how do we do it, what do we have to use to do that is a very interesting and important question. So this morning I heard our incoming president, Vanessa Siddle-Walker, talking about her research on how what she's learned about how organizations managed in times that she claimed were much more troubled, if anything, than the ones we're living in now, managed to actually be effective with much less resources, much fewer resources, much less leverage. And one of the things that I think I understood her to be saying was that they were very strategic about how they leverage who said what and about what to whom, which I think fits very well with the persuasion notion. I think there are some important things to learn historically about how in other troubled times there were opportunities to make change or to communicate or to be persuasive that actually were effective and what that could tell us. So that leads me to say that an important part of that strategy is thinking, what do we actually mean when we're talking about evidence? I hear us at times sounding very sort of a little bit navel-gazy, like, oh, we're feeling a little left out, like we have science and nobody understands that we have science. Don't think that's the place to start. That's our internal problem. I think if we're actually persuasive and we think about what we have to mobilize and we're smart about that, the story will fill in itself, because as people who are education scholars, we will demonstrate that education research has things to bring to bear. But that leads me to say that we have a challenge, however, because what we mean by evidence and what we feel challenged to prove that we have can really limit our ability to be effective in this persuasion or teaching regime. So for instance, getting trapped in the history of what has been either internally or externally counted as evidence could trap us into actually reinforcing racism, reinforcing the current times. I'll give a few examples. So education research has given us things like the achievement gap, like talking about growth, by talking about qualifications of teachers, by talking about children as though they're behind, ahead, below, above, things that seem to be like neutral constructs to talk about what we call research aren't neutral at all. So it's actually going to be super important for us to be thinking about what the range of things are that we can mobilize to be persuasive. And that might include, for instance, historical information, like I already mentioned about Professor Walker's research, Professor Siddle-Walker. It might include very different sorts of uses of comparative evidence than we typically use. It might include using the experiences and voices of people who don't register clearly in the research paradigm. I think thinking about persuasion or about teaching means mobilizing evidence in order to serve your purpose, and broadening and being careful about what we actually mean. Then even the notion of objectivity, I would love to talk more about that, because that also has had a highly conservative way of thinking. It can be persuasive on one hand and buy us some respect, but it can also undermine what we're actually trying to communicate. So finding ways to figure out what are the points of persuasion, what is the evidence, and remembering to have, at least in the TIDAR communities, a very serious discussion that's critical about what we mean when we say evidence, what we mean when we say bias, and using that in the service of actually learning to be surprised about things, learning to learn, but also learning how to be at once both scholars and activists. And as I said earlier, I think that doing that well actually will advance education research, because as we do that and are effective at it, we will make the case that people who do this kind of work are people who have things to do in this space, and even more so if we can be effective in trying to interrupt things that keep persisting, whether they're ways of talking about and positioning Black and brown children, whether they're ways of talking and positioning teaching as a kind of work, or teachers as people. All of that requires direct confrontation on our part, and I think they could be accommodated well into what Bill's talking about a lack of a regime around this. The second big category I wanted to talk about was, what about our responsibilities? And their room is filled with people that I'm about to talk about, which is that people who will be sitting here, whether here or something like it, I don't exactly know, but being the people who are having this kind of a conversation, which I hope will be a somewhat different one, but still will have to deal with these things. So that suggests to me that more deliberate discussion about how we're recruiting and supporting the people into the range of kinds of work, whether it's the academy or other forms of work that we prepare people in, and now talking particularly about doctoral programs, is really important. We won't have different voices bringing different kinds of expertise and evidence to bear if we don't broaden whom it is we're bringing in and preparing, and that can't stop there, because in fact, going to Joyce's point about we've been made into people who fit in, doctoral programs are still incredibly conservative a lot of the time, and we're engaged in a conversation in another part of our life here where we're, if anything, increasing the conservatism of that, and I would welcome some argument about that. But if we're expecting people to be scholars and activists and to do that rigorously and to own what rigor can mean and to own what evidence can mean, then I think doctoral programs have to take more seriously what we hope people will be able to do wherever they work when they leave doctoral programs. And I'm not owning that only by the University of Michigan. I suspect from the things I hear from colleagues when my doctoral students apply for jobs and what they're expected to know and not what they're not even expected to know makes me wonder whether this isn't part of that conversation. And finally, of course, as we bring in people, whether it's into universities or into other settings where this kind of work gets done, we have to think about how we mentor and support the next generation of people. The attacks in my own field in math education on people who are doing scholarships this year is horrifying, and it's not the only field in which that's happening. So there's a responsibility among those of us who are in the field to be looking out for the opening up of the discourse so that we are able to take advantage of new voices, new kinds of evidence. And this takes me back, I think, to where Jim began us, which is about the threat to democracy. Thinking about the performance last night, if we are the we in public education, or we take Bob Moses's injunction to claim the we in the preamble to the Constitution, then that is about our field, both in how we learn to be persuasive, but also how we think about the next generation of people whom we need, their identities, their experiences, what they bring, and help them to be people who can do this work going forward. So I'll stop with that.
We're going to open it up for questions and comments, additional thoughts and perspectives on the issues we raised. I was going to be a runner and have a mic here, right here. Okay.
I'm not a professor, I'm a practitioner, they call me. And I'm a former... my name is Monty Thornburg. I'm a former student of Dr. King. And So anyway, I guess there's many things I could talk about. One, of course, would be a course that I took from Dr. King that was very transformative for me in learning to critically examine what's going on in education. So what I want to say is there's also been a movement that we're looking more in the broader world of what's happened. So we've had these arguments about monuments, for example, that's happened in the United States, tearing down monuments and what that means and so on and so forth. And I just want to point out that thanks to Dr. King, I was able to do some research and have some recognition for someone who was a transformative figure, African-American superintendent in Alabama. And I just want to explain one of the things that he did was, because you brought up the 50-year anniversary, I'm also in my 50th year anniversary of going to Alabama in the Teacher Corps. And the person I'm talking about actually changed the name of a school, which was quite transformative at the time, because all the black schools in the area that I worked were called training schools. There were no high schools. But he was able to change the name of a school in his county to Paramount High School. And he named the school after, I've been to the mountaintop and I may not get there with you. And in 2013, I was able to give a presentation and work with this individual, and in my speech I was able to point out that this schools still had signage on the interstate and on the other major highway and so forth. Paramount High School became quite significant because it was named after such an important speech. And then those signs came down. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Asnat Felus. I'm from the University of Ottawa. Thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating presentation of perspectives. As you were speaking, I heard in my mind over and over an echo of the impossible notion, the impossibility of having a view from nowhere. We cannot have a view from nowhere. I mean, we, even as educational researchers, we have our histories, we have our narratives, we have our identities, and so my comment or question would be, how do we, and Deborah talked about, I think you provided an answer to the question, open up discourse between scholars, but the notion of this conflict between the impossibility of being able to do research from nowhere, being absolutely objective, and on the other hand, being able to really make a difference in a way that really cares for everyone without considering histories, narratives, or identities.
I'm going to ask something because I didn't know whether it was a commentary that you were making, Monty, or just. No, that's okay. You know, commentaries are good. We do testimonies. We do a lot of important things here. So that's good. That's very, very good. So actually, I'm just inviting the panel to respond to both.
Well, I was going to actually respond to the second.
That's good. Good.
And what I was going to say is, one of the points I was trying to make is that the notion of objectivity and values, that what Murdahl and what Clark are trying to say, Clark goes on in wonderful epilogue with Dargetto to say that questions that have no value frame aren't worth asking. He said, I can't look at the poverty and suffering in Harlem and not evoke values. But what Murdahl was trying to say, that it helps us to become objective by making the values explicit so that other people can know what those values are. And what Sandra Harding is saying is that the more people participate in framing what objectivity is, you get what she calls strong objectivity. So the values need to be explicit, according to Murdahl and Clark and Sandra Harding, so that we will know what they are, so that people, for example, when Bernstein pretended he was just totally objective, and when he was oppressing black folks, he could say, oh, I can avoid being what Lorraine Code calls avoiding epistemic responsibility. You can just say, I'm just being objective, without uncovering what those values were. So yes, no frame of research is without a valid framework. And Clark goes on to say, it's not worth pursuing if it doesn't, if we're not aware that it makes a difference.
Hi, I'm Dave Berliner, and I thought I'd add a comment that affected me for everybody. Jim raises the issue of the intellectual's role. You raised the issue of the 50th anniversary, and it triggered something in me. It's also the 50th anniversary of Noam Chomsky's wonderful New York Review of Books article. The year I left Stanford was the year you came there, and he wrote that article on the obligations of an intellectual, and you should reread it. I just did again. But the point is that when I did my book, which was a kind of a protest book called The Manufactured Crisis, I sent him a copy telling him I admired him. And he sent back a very nice compliment. And then I wrote him again. This was pre-email. And I wrote him back a little note. And I said, I just admire you so for staying at it day in and day out, for fighting the forces that you think are wrong. And I said, how do you do it? And the note I got back is what I want to share, because these are hard times. He said, I'm pretty close to the quote, if I do nothing, nothing happens. If I do something, chances are nothing will happen. But I can look in the mirror in the morning. So there's a lesson for all of us. We need to be able to look in the mirror in the morning and know we did what we could.
Hi, my name is Esther Enright. I'm going to stand up so I could see the whole panel. I have a question that I think connects with one of the through threads across the different presentations, just this idea of like rethinking objectivity and using persuasion to overcome these oppressive regimes. And one of the questions that was raised was, how do we better prepare the next generation of educational researchers to do that? And I kind of want to ask the second maybe part of that question, which is then how do we ensure then when they get to these institutions, particularly our universities, that the promotion and tenure and the incentive process is less violent to scholars of color, less violent to women, less violent to our international scholars, our queer-identified scholars, and actually respects and honors and makes space for activism as impact and disruption as impact and the other forms of impact that all of you raised. Thank you.
Well, I think Joyce should go because I already said something about this. So.
Well, I'm speaking from the perspective of a 70-year-old who I recognize that I mentioned the continuity of the times that we are in, but that doesn't mean they're all the same. And so I've been tenured a couple of times. The first time I was tenured at Santa Clara University in the 80s, my dean had previously invited me to go someplace else because I had invited 2 communists to come and speak to my class. And so I was at a Jesuit institution that had values declared in their mission, and I used to carry the mission statement of the university around in my book bag and whip it out, you know, when the moment arose. But that was then. So as we go through different decades, there's a different climate, a different circumstance. And so I would say to anybody who's coming up for tenure, you have to really know something about the institution that you're in. You have to know something about the regime that the people, the influencers, the people who are in charge are going to reflect back to you. And I say to my students, you have to have a plan B. That may not be where you end up staying. I received a Kellogg Fellowship when I was at Santa Clara and wasn't sure that I was going to take it because it seemed to be not in my sort of ideological framework. And I went to see Herbert Aptheker. If you don't know who he is, look him up. It was biographer of Du Bois and a very strong radical scholar. So I was seeking someone who could advise me where I would have some simpatico outlook, someone that I could trust. So when I went to see Aptheker, he was in his little office, hunched over a typewriter, and I said, I just wanted to ask your advice about whether I should accept this fellowship. And he said, oh, it's nothing but cadre training for the bourgeoisie. Yeah, go ahead and take it. And then he just kept typing. So then you know you're not deceiving yourself. You know what you're going into. I got the Kellogg Fellowship. They tried to throw me out, but they didn't. and I made my contribution and I went on. So it's going back to Dr. Berlinder's statement. How do you stay longer? How do you stay in? And you make these decisions all the time. So don't be afraid of pushback and resistance. That's there. But you count on who you are and what you can do, what you're called upon to do. And remember that in every decade, people have had to do work with much less than what you have.
I don't know, Deborah, you want to comment before me?
Go ahead, I'll comment after you.
I wanted to share kind of two perspectives. One is institutional, and one is a personal thing that happened to me at Washington. One, I think that what's happened at the University of Washington, I was the first African-American scholar to arrive at the School of Education in 1969 after leaving Michigan State. I was, after Deborah spoke last night, I said to Cherry, isn't Michigan State wonderful? Michigan State has just done wonderful things. Even though she's at Michigan, I attributed her to Michigan State. But after I came from Michigan State and entered university, but everybody was the first black in those days. But the first black was in history, the first black was in social work. But one of the things that happened over this, I'm celebrating my 49th year at the University of Washington, which will be my last. But what happened is the institution began to change over those 49 years. For example, so one of the institutional responses is for the university to hire people who are committed to diversity, white allies, which we've hired, Latinos and blacks. We have a very multicultural faculty now, about 25% folks of color, I would think. So that's one solution, to hire folks committed to these ideals. And I think it becomes less of an issue. But I did want to share a story. My faculty, I got an early promotion because I had written quite a bit as a graduate student when I was at Michigan State. But one of the things that happened, so my faculty voted overwhelmingly for me to be promoted. But I'll never forget what one professor wrote. And by the way, the comments were anonymous. He said, he's a very bright young man. I just wish he would do something significant, that he would publish something. But it was a minor voice. And I kept publishing what I was publishing.
Do you want to go on, Vivian? Yes, please. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. So when I posed that I appreciated Joyce's comment to Esther as for all the young scholars in the room, and I think it was really important. And I wanted to take another perspective in addition, which has to do with my experience being a dean and also being a senior faculty member at a pretty elite institution that's pretty white and pretty conservative. And I experienced this both inside my institution, and I experience it as a fragile matter. That is, one can have these conversations that change the way people look at faculty members' work and the kind of support that's provided, but it's very fragile, and it easily, kind of like the Martin Luther King quote, one step forward, like 5 steps back. So I'm actually challenging us across our field, those of us who are in positions where we actually evaluate and support early career scholars and later career scholars, to talk to each other about what we're actually doing. When we institute these practices of the way we reward, evaluate, tenure people, we're effectively creating the faculty or the education researchers of the future. We're signaling what's valued. So I remember at one point, one very good provost at Michigan who asked a group of us, what would you say about whether the practices of tenure here are creating the people you would want to have as associate professors? And it was pretty clear the answer was no, because the signals were publish by yourself, don't worry too much about your teaching, don't do too much that's risky out there, don't take stands. And so it caused people to have a conversation about if the tenure process has any value, which is a whole different conversation, but let's say it does, it should signal what it is you should do to become more and more the sort of person that can use the space that being an academic, now I'm confining myself to the tenure issue, use the space of being what an academic can do. And that, to me, is a continuity between doctoral programs, hiring practices, and then support, and then tenure. And so in part, I was asking those of us who are in positions to be having those discussions as we hire people, as we evaluate, to think really hard about what we're doing when the kinds of things we're signaling will not create the cadre of scholars 20 years from now that we need in this field to deal with the problems we're talking about here. And that is something we can do something about. Those things are both institutional and they're field-based because we experience signals from other institutions as we make these decisions. So I wanted to ask those of us who are in those positions to think about that some more because I think it's crucial.
Thank you, Deborah. I just wanted to say one thing, make another point. So there's a lot of discussion, as there should be, around the transitions into the professorate and how we're preparing doctoral students, and those are incredibly important and critical issues. I would also kind of bring up another issue, which has to do with the context itself and what I consider the kind of changing nature of the context and the inherent issues around safety within the context. I, too, was the first person of color in my school of education at the University of Pennsylvania. That was in 1996 to get tenure. So, you know, there are these ebbs and flows that are just shocking, and you think, you know, about what happens. But here is something that kind of informed my focus on this topic. I have never, having grown up in the family I did, there were times when I was a child when I felt unsafe. And as civil rights folks, there was always a possibility that someone was going to bomb our house, for instance. But I have never really felt unsafe in my classroom at the university until recently. And it's not as though there are people coming into the building, but there are increasing threats against faculty members by, not necessarily just at Penn, but via tweets, via phone calls, via email. And I'm just kind of curious about how we think about addressing some of the impending dangers that I simply don't remember even worrying about in years past. And when we talk about kind of changing discourse, how do we support our graduate students, two of my former ones right over there, lovely that they are, as well as our early career scholars who I feel are being targeted in a way that those of us who are more senior are not. And what kinds of suggestions, what kinds of concerns might we take to our administrations and for our field more broadly?
So the knife to the gunfight.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, I don't know how many times I can say. So if you're in this persuasion game and you've chosen the right target, you're going to have an advocacy group that's going to be advocating for certain things, and they're going to be using social media to advocate for them, and they're going to spin certain sound bites and storylines that are quite powerful. We saw it in math education just this year with really an article that, I mean, was really in a fugitive literature. I mean, it wasn't like it was even in a mainstream outlet. I'm being frank. I mean, it wasn't like it was fugitive literature. Like, can you find it? I mean, you know, and someone found it, and then it just went viral. But it's all part of a package in a system that we don't seem to want to acknowledge exists. These are regimes, these are public-private partnerships of people who are very organized in how they're coming after you. And to go after a faculty member at an institution is part of the strategy. It's a way of silencing those who heretofore, because of tenure and things of that sort, were given the authority and power and could speak out. So if I threaten you, if I say I'm going to come to your university, they're dropping leaflets off en masse, and folks are walking around looking crazy. You saw the Charlottesville thing. I mean, they didn't target UVA by accident. That was done strategically for what the institution represents, the Jeffersonian ideas, what the university was supposed to be about. So I just think we have to wake up. And so as administrators, in these institutions, we need to understand that faculty are going to continue to be under assault. We need to be able to prepare our communication regimes to let it be known that we are supportive of their right to speak and to do, lay out the evidence they have brought to bear. And similarly, I hate to say it, but we need to also be able to provide them security. These people are crazy. I mean, this is not a joke. I mean, we are really in that kind of time right now. And I do agree, Joyce, it is a continuation. They always been crazy. But now it's okay, and you co-signed on it, and you could come up on Fox News and supposedly legitimate journalists and all this fake stuff that they're putting out there. They're all organized. And if you don't get that, I mean, I just think you need to wake up. That's where we are right now, and Jim brought it up, and that's the form of democracy we're in. That's why it's so just hanging on the balance, because we can't speak out without threat of harm, and I just think it's going to escalate.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I'm so enthusiastically recommending Madeleine Albright's book, because she is really illuminating the fragility of democracy, not only in France and England with Brexit, but she also has a chapter on the U.S. that's really worth reading.
Let me offer two thoughts here. After Trump was elected, there were three of us who organized this thing, USC Faculty Resistance, and we got something like 300 faculty members to sign a document, believe me, getting people to commas and semicolons, poof. But we got 300 people, but there were three of us who organized it, and we put a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times, "We are USC." And it was really, if I do say so myself, a very mild, forthright document. It was not radical at all. The university didn't want us to do it, and they didn't want us to do it because of what happened. Because the three of us got horrible emails and tweets and comments, only one of which I had to turn over to the police. But I mean, now I know what to do when someone says I'm going to shoot you. But if I don't do it, what message am I sending to my graduate students and undergraduates? But here's the other thing that's scary, and that's that our provost brought a dozen of us in about a month ago. We have a threat assessment team on campus. He gets what he says is one valid threat a week. And we said, what do you mean by a valid threat? And he said, either a person has said, I feel someone is physically going to harm me, or someone else has seen someone. And he said, twice during the course of this year, we almost had a disaster. He said, as provost, I never, ever thought that I would be spending my time having to decide, shut the campus down, which we've done once this year. So again, it is a continuation, but they are now legitimated to do horrible things and say horrible things.
Silence is no longer safe. No. So for those who want to be silent, you're not safe. You're not going to be safe.
But I think an implication of what Bill said, or what really everyone is saying, is this can't be all individual. Like, it can't be each person who gets a threat has to handle that on their own. And that was what was going on inside of Math Ed until we began to build up some collective. Like, what is it? How do we develop the collective knowledge and skill to actually know what to do, that it's not one person, it's not all isolated, and that's not necessarily our way of working in the academy. Everybody's kind of on their own, so they're in their classroom, or they don't know they should say anything, and they are personally threatened. And this is, to be fair, it way disproportionately affecting faculty of color, young faculty, women. So I think there is, again, one of these matters about collective action, which we've been talking about in several ways this afternoon. How do we work against the tendency toward highly isolated work in the academy and think about what we do together about any of these matters we're talking about today? And that isn't something we have a long history of always doing. We have some histories of it.
Hi there. My name is Chris. I'm a doctoral student at Michigan State University. Go Green. I also have 2 degrees from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Kind of a walking house divided. My question is for Dr. Tate. I'm really intrigued by your idea of finding common ground in this work as we're working with other researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And I'm wondering how, if you have any thoughts about how we can engage in that work in a way that is truly equitable and in a way where we can avoid falling into the many perils of interest convergence.
Well, the last statement is fascinating. How do you fall into the perils of interest convergence? Because in essence, I'm saying you need to find interest convergence. But I think, first of all, I want to back up on this statement. It assumes that people are rational, all right? And so part of the dilemma is I can show you in cost-benefit analysis the value, for example, of expanding medical insurance in the state of Missouri. I can show you that it would have benefit for education. I could show you that have benefit for health of families long term. I can show you that it would have tremendous economic benefit over and above the initial investment. So what I'm saying to you is that I need to be able to go down and deal with the state legislature representative from the Boot Hill of Missouri and say, you know, this isn't just going to help the students and families in Kansas City and St. Louis, but it's going to help you down here in the Boot Hill. Now, what we have found in doing this is that in the state of Missouri, they're not rational. So while I certainly think we need to have a common ground metric when we think about the C's, it does assume some level of rationality. So I'm not sure about what you mean about the, going at this in an equitable way. I just think we have to try to go at it in a way that we still step out for people the win-wins and let them see it. And to the extent that we create our own persuasion regimes, we have our own advocacy groups that we're working with others to make the case, that we make it really transparent to the elites that we have to influence. A lot of policy is at the state level. We tend to talk about Trump a lot. And, but point of fact, I'm dealing with a much more challenging situation other than Syria. Trump, like my state is really a piece of work. We have travel advisories with NAACP. They're telling people not to come. We're getting letters. I'm the graduate dean from Chinese students to say they don't want to come to study in Missouri. They're afraid, not because of the crime, because of the racism. Trying to make these kinds of cases with people in a rational fashion is that's my only plea. But the psychologists tell me that people have poor heuristic judgment. And so I think we still have to go back to building these partnerships. Now, that goes to your question. Universities are complicit. So we create a ton of research that is rarely leveraged in a way locally to make the case for anything other than cancer. So we are hellified good at telling the story about cancer. We get it done, right? And I know USC does. Michigan does, WashU, Washington. We've got that cancer story down. We do not leverage our schools of education, social work, social policy findings in the same packaging that we do with our cancer work. We don't go to our trustees and donors. In fact, the trustees don't even know half the time what's going on in these areas. So we don't leverage these elites because our trustees are our forum into this elite group. We don't leverage them. We hide our information half the time. It's really sad. And then we go in and take property from folks off the tax. I don't want to go here right now. I can't go. I got to stop. But my bottom line deal is we have our own internal problems on our campuses. Just look at your campus newspaper and see what's promoted and where they leverage conversations and about what. That'll tell you a lot. That's the starting point. If this seems big to you, just go home and deal with it. Just deal with your campus newspaper. Study comes out on X, Y, and Z. Something happens in social work. Synthesize it and try to get a package story outside of cancer.
I just want to add, I said we need to pay attention to the context that you're in. We have a senior administrator. Well, my institution is like being called the Cinderella of equity because we're now graduating more African American students than any other institution in the country. But the senior administrator that I spoke with said that he doesn't use the word liberal education when he talks to the legislature because they get confused with the word liberal. So at the same time that we are graduating all of these students who are going to be making impacts in all the ways that we are concerned, the reality is that many of these students graduate with no sense of who they are as African American people in Atlanta, Georgia, the black Mecca of the U.S. So these contradictions exist across the board. And it just means you take what you can get your arms around and you work on that, recognizing where you are.
Hi, my name is Roberto Garcia. My dissertation was Teacher Talk in the Classroom and the War Metaphor. And everything that everybody had to say resonated with me, but I asked for your comment on this notion that the nature of teaching is to promote democracy, to create an environment that is mutually improving and mutually safe. But the contradiction and the tension is that we impose consent. It's very subtle. Sometimes it's very explicit, but it creates the tension in the classroom. And so the challenge is that when we promote this mutual improvement and mutual safety, and we impose consent in order to deliver this improvement and safety, that we're not generating the moral courage and the moral outrage at all levels to speak out against the regimes and the intellectual warfare and the obvious contradictions that sometimes we're lost on how to respond. So I'd like you to share your sense on this tension that exists at all levels. But as a practitioner who taught for 20 years in the classroom, I would try to understand why can't I move my students beyond the content to what is happening outside. And I was challenged to give them the voice that would allow them to express their outrage and their courage.
Read my article in 2SE, Who Will Make America Great Again? Black People, of course. And I describe my pedagogy to do just what you said.
Yeah, I've written about teachers like that. Generally, they get fired or run out. But the ones I've studied have had problem-solving teams, get rid of all kinds of horrific activities in their communities. They've done these kinds of things where they help the kids learn how to problem solve, engage in civic activities and the like, to eliminate all kinds of things that add disparity to their lives. And many times it's quite ironic. They're not run off by elites, they're often run off by their colleagues. It's really a self-loathing in some ways that's quite shocking. I don't continue to write in this area anymore, but when I did, I really found it quite shocking.
Yes, go ahead. Hello, my name is James Wright, and I am a recent graduate of Michigan State University. And I'm about to. Yeah, I heard about that, but I don't know. So, and I'm an early career academic. I just was recently hired at San Diego State University. And my question is, and I want to thank you all for this fascinating conversation. And my question is directed towards a comment made by Dr. King, but everyone can chime in as if there's some additional discussion around it. But the mention of the global consciousness during your time as a graduate student. Some of my work, what I've noticed when I look back in my historical work, I see that that global consciousness was something that was really evident amongst scholars of color and students of color, and then like so in contemporary work and research, I noticed that's not the case as much. So I wondered about your thoughts on that, and with regards to why do you think that is, and was there a need at the time, and has that need, does that need no longer exist, or just some thoughts as to why that was the case then and not so much the case now, and is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, I think we all up here have some aspect of international work that we could speak to, but I would just say that it's not so much that a global interest doesn't exist, it's what are the interests at the global level that get attention and supported. So we haven't talked about what's happening in Africa, we can talk about China. I mean, just recognize that interest exists in every realm, and being conscious of which interests you want to engage and be supportive of is a part of your agency. And so you may have to bring a focus that doesn't exist. But at my university, faculty get evaluated and you get to tick off a box if what you did was international. And you get chips for that. But it's not asking what is the nature of your international work and what interests are you pursuing?
Well, in my work, what I try to underscore to my students and in my writing is that you really can't understand the U.S. Unless you look at it within a global context, and how you have to understand how these problems cross boundaries. When I first went to do research in England, and my first sabbatical in 1974, they told me racism was a U.S. problem. And then they had the Brexit riots and whatever, and now they say, Jim, come join us. So I think that they now understand that these problems have to be looked at within a global context, or we will get restricted understanding. If America, well, I grew up in the Black South thinking that racism was just directed toward black folks, until I, of course, arrived in Chicago and expanded my horizon to understand that racism was a universal phenomenon. So I think global perspectives are very needed to deepen understandings for our students and faculty.
And it's particularly important at this moment. So when an administration puts forward a travel ban, and I'm at a university where there are more faculty, staff, and students of Iranian descent than any other university in America, don't I have an obligation to support them? Not everything is objective in terms of when can I speak, just simply because I know a piece of information. There are times as faculty and graduate students and staff where we have to speak up, and in this moment, it's particularly critical with regard to global issues.
So let me say, as the co-host who invited you into the living room, if you were really at my house, we'd stay up all night and really talk further about these issues. One of the messages in my initial email to our colleagues is that this conversation is not new to this century, as Joyce pointed out, or to this decade, or to this year. But the fact that when I was 10 years old, my parents, who called themselves socialists, communists, I lived in a situation where, as working class people, our garbage was picked up by the FBI because they thought my parents had something to say about others. My grandmother and my oldest aunt were threatened with deportation unless they spoke about my parents. When I was an undergraduate at that maroon institution, maybe I'm the only University of Chicago person in this room, we know which maroon we're talking about, one of my undergraduate advisors, and if you You know, the University of Chicago offices are hidden and tucked away in old Gothic rooms. This man was a founder of the Students for Democratic Society, actually a Michigan graduate in social psychology. Without the weaponry that we now see as prevalent as guns, he survived a terrible, brutal stabbing. They never found out why, whether it was just a crazy person. So now we're living in a time where I must say, with all of my sometimes debates with all of you on this podium about where we go and how we do this, this is a moral responsibility for organizations like the American Educational Research Associations, universities. One of you asked a question about what are universities doing about training and capacity building and rethinking doctoral education. Actually, I don't want to say that will be solved, but that's one of the things that there's more consensus around discussing and debating. But it's these very silences of how we protect and advance the integrity of our work that is being silenced, where we need collaboration in higher education and in the scholarly and scientific societies we represent. So expect and see some movement. We may not be able to change things this year, but I hope when we have this conversation again in Toronto, we have something to say.
Thanks, Felice. I just also want to say that this is a pivotal moment. They're all pivotal moments, though. And the question is, how do we really continue a discourse and think about, once again, I think my talk last year, Deborah's talk yesterday, and others before us, actually everyone on this panel included, our talks really are about our deeply held convictions, and as well as the research that we do. And I think they all speak to the question of how we will stand and how persistent we will be in our stand. And so this is a slightly different kind of town hall than we have had in the past. But I think the issues that were raised here kind of speak to the necessity of having this conversation and continuing this discussion in our individual spaces, but also through AERA. And I want to thank the past presidents for bringing this issue to the surface in conversation and with deep respect for each other, but also with our deep respect for you and our ability to take a stand and to figure out what side of history we want to be on. So I wish you well and a continued inspired AERA.
Thank you.